Today we're going to talk about new technologies, color photography. We're going to look at three important artists: Julia Cameron, Edward Steichen, Andre Cortez, some of my favorites. We're now at the end of the 19th century. There are amazing innovations in photography. People are seeing bird's eye views. Towers and balloons were used. Artificial light is coming into vogue. You now have electric batteries and chemical agents that combine to make light. Flash powder was used from the 1880s until the Germans invented the flashbulb in 1925. Until then, there was no practical way to light things, but light them they did. Night scenery came into vogue. X-rays fascinated the viewers. There was the photography of movement. We are just looking at photographs of the times here. It's pictorialism. It's romanticized. I find it a lot of it a little bit sappy. But these are photographs of the times. People are photographing movement. Edward Muybridge and Thomas Eakins in the US were the men of the time. Muybridge photographed for Leland Stanford. You've probably heard his name. They've named towns after him in Florida and such. He was the president of a railroad, the ex-governor of California, a horse breeder, extremely rich. And he backed Muybridge, who proved that at a certain time, in a horse's stride, all 4 feet were off the ground at the same time. This was a revelation. People might have thought it, but you couldn't prove it. But now they knew it. Muybridge used 24 cameras, 6 inches apart, and usually had a few on the sides of the scene. There were grids on the wall to mark the action. By this time, dry plates had been invented, or this setup would have been impossible. He filmed people walking, running, jumping, spinning, laying bricks, among other activities. That's kind of what a setup would look like of his. Science and art became intertwined. People used the stop motion of the camera for their paintings. Horse paintings changed radically once the painter could see what a running horse actually looked like. Degas used photos of dancers that he took for his work. In 1888, Kodak came into being. What George Eastman really did was develop processing made easy. You could buy his little camera loaded with film, shoot the film, and present it for processing. They would take your camera and present you with another one fully loaded, and you would return to get your processed film later. Street life and private moments became fair game for almost everyone with the price of a small camera. Everyone could now shoot pictures. These are Stieglitz's photographs. Auguste and Louis Lemaire, 2 brothers in France, were at work on new inventions. They are responsible for the autochrome Lumiere, the first really successful color photography. It was expensive, involved long exposures, the color was quite subtle, and it wasn't easy to view, but it worked. They are also the inventors of the motion picture. They first projected a movie in 1895. This history-making event featured 10 short films. One of them was workers leaving their factory. The running time, 50 seconds, hand crank seconds. They went on the road with their cinema. They knew how to make and promote movies. We're going to look at art photography another way. Stieglitz is really the man who promoted photography above all others. This is one of his very famous New York scenes. He loved the gray, the weather, the night. He was a true artist. But a lot of this stuff, pictorialism, the camera images might engage the feelings and the senses. That was the aim. It was a celebration Artistic camera images were beauty rather than fact. Sharpness could be a limitation. Camera groups were forming all over the world. Common to them was the promotion of camera art. We're going to look at some Julia Cameron's photography here. She was an early pictorialist. She was dead by the end of the 1800s. She was a true Victorian. And I want to talk a little bit about the camera groups as we scroll through some of her work. Photosecession was a movement of the early 20th century that promoted photography as a fine art in general and photographic pictorialism in particular. The viewpoint was controversial, that what was significant about a photo was not what was in front of the camera, but the manipulation by the artist to achieve his own particular vision. This is Julia herself. This is her husband. Look at the focus on that. In Germany, there was the Wiener Camera Club with K's. England had the Linked Ring. There was the Photo Club de Paris in France. In this country, it was the Photosecession in New York in 1902, led by Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen. The most famous gallery was in New York, the Little Galleries of the Photosecession. It became known as 291 for its address on Fifth Avenue. They also launched Camera Works magazine from there. Stieglitz did some of the first night photography. His gallery, 291, showed photography and the other fine arts. Stieglitz discovered Georgia O'Keeffe. Not only did he discover her, but he married her. Other artists who had their first shows at his gallery include Steichen, Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, Braque, Toulouse-Lautrec, Henri Rousseau, Severini, and Brancusi. Now that is quite a lineup. He was an amazing man who did more to promote photography as belonging among the fine arts than anyone else. So Julia, she was born in Calcutta, the fourth of 10 children born to James Paddle, an official of the East India Company. She was sent to her grandparents at Versailles when she was 3, not to return to Calcutta till she was a young woman, considered old enough to survive the diseases of the East. She met her husband when they were both at the Cape of Good Hope recovering from tropical diseases. She also met her photographic mentor there, Sir John Herschel. That is Herschel. He was from a family of astronomers. And he'd gone to the Cape to see the stars there. Cameron went back to India and he to England, and they kept in touch. Remember Herschel, he's credited with using the term photography first, and he also invented hypo. He no doubt sent Cameron the first photos she ever saw. The Camerons moved to England. There, she no doubt saw many photo exhibits. Her sister held a popular salon where she met the movers and shakers of the day, artists, politicians, royalty. In 1863, she was 48, a middle-aged woman who was given a present of a camera by her children, and her passion was born. She wanted to do portraits. Carte de vis were the popular photos of the day, and we know from her writing that she considered them documents, not personal expressions. The work of a tradesman, not an artist. She felt they did little to elevate the spirit. She determined that her photos would be different. She loved soft focus. This is deliberate. She was interested in creating an expressive interpretation of her subject, more so than a highly detailed formal portrait. She used wet collodion glass negatives printed on albumen paper, not an easy process. Her long exposures that blurred the subject, her choice of a lens with a short focal length, which yielded a shallow depth of field, these were choices she made. Cameron was driven by old-fashioned values and modern ambition. A good portrait artist will skillfully transcribe the outer features of her subject, she said. A great one gets at the inner characteristics of her sitters and thus, through them, at an evocation of their time. But don't let that kind of talk fool you. She was a very shrewd businesswoman. All her portraits were registered with the Copyright Office. Many of her portraits were of famous people she met through her sister's salon. Many of these portraits of famous people are the only ones that exist, photography still being so new. She was able to make money doing what she loved. Her photography falls into two main categories: closely cropped and framed portraits and illustrative allegories based on religious and literary works. She saw the allegories as comparable to the oil paintings of the day. Her niece, Julia Jackson, her favorite subject, this is Julia, was the mother of Virginia Woolf, the writer. They're quite lovely, aren't they? Julia and her husband moved once again to Calcutta, where she had trouble getting chemicals and clean water. She couldn't process, and almost no images from that era remain. She caught a chill, and she died there in 1879. Her photographic career lasted all of 11 years. And then we have Edward Steichen. I am particularly fond of him. He really was the first commercial photographer. He was born in Luxembourg in 1879. The family came to Chicago and then moved to Milwaukee. He became an apprentice with the American Fine Art Company as a designer for the lithographic firm. He taught himself to draw and paint and photograph in his spare time. He was a founder of the Art Students League of Milwaukee. These are early pictorialist photos. He was interested in nature, and he found it most beautiful at twilight. Gray or misty days made for moody pictures that he loved. He also loved accidents. On one occasion, he was making a long exposure and accidentally kicked the tripod while the shutter was open. It created a whole new type of diffusion in the negative. When he would show the print around, he was greeted with, "That's artistic," and he found that was something to strive for. At 21, he finished his apprenticeship, and I do mean finished. He was making $50 a week, a great deal of money then, but he decided to quit and go to Paris. He stopped in New York to meet Alfred Stieglitz, who bought 3 prints for $5 each, saying, "I am robbing you at that price." But Steichen thought it was a princely sum. Stieglitz must that he would probably become a painter now that he was going to Paris. But Steichen remembers yelling up from the elevator car, "I will always stick to photography." Aren't these portraits magical? Look how they're lit. They are just, to me, they are true beauty. He came back from Europe and he opened a studio at 293 Fifth Avenue across from 291 and was getting plenty of work. But he wasn't happy artistically, so in 1906 he packed up and he went back to Paris. Rodin moved his Balzac into the open air so Steichen could photograph it. He suggested it be done by moonlight. There was no guide. He had to guess. He worked all night. 15 minutes to an hour was the time for each exposure. Stieglitz bought those prints. I think I have one in here, and gave them to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The rest of his prints and negatives from those times were lost when the family was forced to flee ahead of the Germans. World War I, humidity, and bacteria took care of the rest. I love his portraits of the industrial titans of the day. Look at the chair. It looks like he's holding a knife, doesn't it? And this titan looks like he's about to come flying out of that chair and strangle you. Or possibly the photographer. That's Stieglitz and one of his little girls. He became a fashion photographer. The first. In 1911, photos of designer gowns by Paul Prouvet were published in Art de Decoration. He served in World War I and World War II and made major contributions to military photography. After the Second World War, he was the director of photography at New York City's Museum of Modern Art. He created the Family of Man exhibition and the book. It consists of 500 pages, 500 photos depicting life and death in 68 different countries. I've got some pictures in here of that exhibition. His brother-in-law, Carl Sandburg, wrote the foreword to the book. In 1963, he was awarded the Medal of Freedom presented by President Ford. His death came in 1973. There's the Balzac by moonlight. He photographed the great artists of the day, society ladies, society portraits, the homes of the rich. But he had that great sense of design. Didn't matter what it was the design that mattered. And he found it everywhere. Isn't that a great one? That's a famous actress. And the name just totally escapes me. Might be Sarah Bernhardt. That's one of his most famous images. That's his brother-in-law and his sister. He photographed the very famous of the time. Fashionistas, actresses, gowns. He was there. They paid him big bucks. And yet simple forms always appealed. I've always loved this one. And this one. It's Lionel Barrymore. I think he's Drew's grandfather. Might be great. Actresses, dancers, Paul Robeson. Fred Astaire. Look how it's lit from down below. That is extremely unusual. He was very creative. This is one of his most famous portraits, Greta Garbo. I love this one even more, Gloria Swanson. Lighting, again, it's very unusual to ever see a person lit from below. It makes odd things happen. Beautiful, huh? Lighting again, below. Yep, the first commercial photographer, Edward Steichen, a very famous comic of the day. W.C. Fields. He also went on to work for Life magazine, did photo essays for them, medical photography. These next couple were ads for Kodak. Anyone could take a beautiful photo. He did a series on homeless women of New York. Look how they're lit. And framed. He was not afraid, as evidenced by the lighting on this portrait. He liked to superimpose things in the darkroom, too. That's the brother-in-law, Carl Sandburg. Abraham Lincoln's death mask. Churchill. FDR. Isn't that a striking portrait? One of those movie stars. Famous horses. I'm pretty sure that's Irving Berlin. A fighter. Brancusi. Charlie Chaplin. Today he'd be working for Vanity Fair and/or People. Joshua Heifetz. The lighting. Look at the lighting. Walt Disney. This one's called Sunburn. Baby Things. It's called Baby Things. Loved the night photography. Loved reflections. Here's some of the World War II images. This one's from Iwo Jima. Family of Man. Very famous at the time. It was mind-boggling to most people. And then he got older and he started photographing mostly around the house in Connecticut. Grandchildren swimming. This tree of his he photographed hundreds of times in all seasons, in all weather. It became quite famous, this tree. And his lovely wife. And there he is. The last photographer's work we're going to look at is Cortez. Versailles said about Cortez, he has two qualities that are essential for a great photographer: an insatiable curiosity about the world, about people, and about life, and a precise sense of form. Now, these are the early pictorial days in Hungary. He's known for his composition and the photo essay, along with unconventional camera angles. He is considered a seminal figure of photojournalism. His family expected him to be a stockbroker. He did photography in his spare time. He served in World War I, and at the age of 25, he moved to Paris, the art capital of the world. Among other Hungarian artists who made the same move were Robert Capa, very famous photographer, made his bones at war photography, Brassai, Man Ray, and Lucien Agner. He found work with magazines and was involved with the Dada movement and achieved critical and commercial success quite early. I have always loved this one. The angle is just astonishing. But Cortez was a Jew, and he knew fame would not save him from the Nazis. He moved to the US in 1936 and started to rebuild his career. He worked for numerous magazines, Harper's Bazaar, Town and Country, Vogue. Vogue asked him to join the staff. Isn't that lovely? But he chose to join Life magazine instead. Life was the famous photo magazine. You could work a year on a project. And then they would give you many, 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 many pages in the magazine. And it was large. It was oversized. It was bigger than any magazine that is on the market or has been in decades. He had sales and he had shows all around the world. And he always felt unrecognized. He did not get the name recognition that Stieglitz and Steichen got. He felt underappreciated. Lovely, isn't it? His favorite quote, "I write with light." He's considered the father of photojournalism. He died in 1985 at the age of 91. I find his sense of form and the way he frames things and his angles to be extraordinary. Look at the light on this. It is magical. And I've always loved this one. She has the same shape as that. I think it's a furnace, but I really don't know. People at work, people at play. Those were all Hungary. And then he moved to Paris. And Paris, for him, must have been heaven. That's Kiki. That's Man Ray's muse. There are books written about this woman. She's the very famous woman taken from the back, her naked back, and Man Ray has painted the cello, the S shapes on her back, probably on the negative rather than on her back. It's a classic. I'll be showing it to you, I'm sure. But his sense of form and his sense of composition is so extraordinary. He liked this couch. He liked that sculpture. I've always loved this photo. They're both twisted. The torso and I think it might be Kiki again. But he made use of backgrounds. He would have slapped you if you'd recommended he use a sweep, I'm quite sure. But he photographed all the grand artists and the writers of the day. Isn't that gorgeous? Look at that. Look at the light and the reflections and the cat. It's perfect. I don't even care if he set it up. It's quite wonderful. Paris must have been so liberating. There we are at the Eiffel Tower. It's a beauty, isn't it? You know, a gray, wet day, most of us might stay inside. But look at these images. They're utterly magnificent. I love chairs too. And of course, he had a pretty good sense of humor. The car parked, the horse parked, the car parked. He was getting some work too for the journals of the day. And I have always found these wonderful. This is done with mirrors. He called them distortions. But he was always creating. He wasn't content. He was always doing something new and doing it so beautifully. Curved mirrors. That's actually a bad slide that said New York. The incredible skill that he had. And there's a self portrait. Graphically, they are utterly beautiful. The reflections are what really make this one in the windows. Just beautiful. He didn't stop working till the day he died. And he found beauty everywhere. So, next, we're on to some of my favorite photographers, probably my favorite era, 20s, 30s, up until the war. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll be talking to you soon.